And the esophagus is pretty simple. The esophagus is really just a transport system. Nothing's really happening in it. We're not releasing any enzymes into the esophagus. We're not breaking food down. We're just moving the food from the pharynx down to the stomach. That's it. So it's a muscular tube that brings food and water down into the stomach. When we look at the lining or the mucosa of the esophagus, we see that it's a stratified squamous epithelium, just like we saw in the mouth, right? So also in the mouth, also in the pharynx. And why is this? What does stratified mean? Layered, right? Multiple layers. Why do you think the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus need to be stratified? Because what do they have to put up with? Friction stuff, right? As we swallow bites of food, bowls of food, water, like that's constantly doing this. It's constantly scraping away at the surface. If we had one layer of cells, you damage the membrane, the cell's dead. And now you've got an ulcer. So we need a stratified layer for protection because those are highly stressed areas. When we look at the submucosa, okay, so remember the mucosa is the innermost layer of the tube, right? This is the tube, the mucosa is the innermost layer, and then underneath that we have the submucosa. When we look at the submucosa of the esophagus, we see esophageal glands, but again, these glands are not releasing any enzymes at all, right? Because the esophagus is just a passageway. The food's not hanging out there, it's not getting broken down, it's simply a passageway. So the glands that are present in the esophagus are just going to be releasing mucus. Why do you think the mucus is important? Perfect. So that the food can go down easier to try and reduce the amount of friction that we have there so that we're not damaging that lining, or we're trying to prevent damaging that lining as much as we can. So the mucus just makes it easier to swallow the food. So remember when we look at the lining of the stomach, we said we have the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis externa, right, is that next layer out. The muscularis externa is, remember, 2 layers of muscle. We have a longitudinal layer, right, that goes along the length of the tube, and then a circumferential layer that circles around the tube, and you guys saw that in lab. The muscularis externa of the esophagus is important because it contracts to give us a type of movement called peristalsis. So peristalsis is a wave-like movement that propels the bolus or bite of food down the esophagus. This is smooth muscle, right? You don't ever think about this. You never consciously are like, okay, esophagus, let's keep that food moving. The minute you push that bolus of food down into the esophagus, the smooth muscle automatically contracts and pushes the bolus of food all the way down. So peristalsis is a wave-like contraction. So what I mean by that is the contraction starts at the top and it continues all the way down like a wave. It's not spotty here, there, everywhere. It's like toothpaste, right? When there's a little bit of toothpaste left and you want to get all of it out, you start from the bottom and you squeeze all the way to the top. Okay, that's how peristalsis works as we push a bolus of food down the esophagus. Food should not be hanging out in the esophagus. Once it goes in, peristalsis should push it all the way down and into the stomach. The lower LES is the lower esophageal sphincter. What else did we call that in lab? Not yet, Tyler works later. Cardiac sphincter, because it's right by the cardia of the stomach. So the lower esophageal sphincter is, if you look, so the esophagus comes down, right? And then you have the stomach. Now your stomach kind of goes like that. There's a big, the stomach goes like that. So the lower esophageal sphincter, cardiac sphincter, is like a circular band of muscle right here at the very bottom of the esophagus. Remember, a sphincter is just a circular band of muscle. Again, this is smooth muscle, so you don't consciously control this. But what this does is effectively acts like a lid on top of the stomach. Okay, again, what do we digest with inside the stomach? Acid. Tons of hydrochloric acid. That's fine in the stomach. The stomach was built to deal with it. The esophagus was not built to deal with it. The esophagus, the throat are not supposed to have acid in them. So the lower esophageal sphincter stays shut and keeps the acid inside the stomach. As a bite of food gets pushed down the esophagus, it'll get forced through and then it shuts again. And that's what keeps all the acid in your stomach. What happens if the lower esophageal sphincter is not working appropriately? If it gets loose on you, what do you experience? GERD, heartburn, acid reflux, right? If you've ever felt that burning sensation or that kind of acid rush up into your throat before, that's because this lower esophageal sphincter is not keeping the acid in your stomach. Okay, so again, it can be just kind of intermittent acid reflux that happens every once in a while if you eat a really greasy hamburger or spaghetti or whatever. Or some people actually have a disorder where they constantly have reflux coming up, and that can be damaging. If you have reflux all the time, that can actually lead to like Barrett's esophagus. It can lead to esophageal cancer. It is very, very damaging to have all the time, and it's just painful. Oosh, that's blurry. So, food first goes into the what? What do we put food in? The oral cavity. How many salivary glands do we have? 6 or 3 pairs. The saliva has enzymes that break down what 2 things? Carbohydrates and lipids. Where do the lipids normally actually get broken down though? In the stomach. Why? Because the pH. Good. So, how do we mechanically break down food in our mouth? Mastication, which is what? Okay. So we put food in the oral cavity, we masticate it, we chew it, we've got a bunch of saliva that moistens it and starts to break it down, and then we push that food back into our oropharynx. Right? When we swallow, the soft palate goes up so that the food doesn't go into the nasal cavity, and the larynx goes up so that the food doesn't go in the respiratory tract. And then all of these muscles push the food down into the esophagus. What do we have a bunch of in the esophagus? What kind of glands? What kind of glands in the esophagus? Mucus glands, right? We just lubricate it. We don't digest anything there. We just lubricate it so the bolus of food can pass through. So this bolus of food gets pushed through the esophagus. What's that type of movement called? Peristalsis. So peristalsis pushes the food through the esophagus. It's nice and lubricated because of all of the mucus, and it gets pushed through this little sphincter right here and into the stomach. What's this sphincter called? The lower esophageal sphincter. Why do we have that? Why not just let the food plop in? Perfect, because we don't want the acid to come out of the stomach and wash up into the esophagus. Good. Pretty simple so far? Pretty simple. All right, so the last thing that we'll talk about today is the stomach. This is where it gets a little bit more complicated, but not much. So the stomach is kind of a part of the GI tract that doesn't really look like a tube, right? It looks like this kind of expanded sac. And one of the reasons for that is that the stomach functions to store relatively large amounts of food, right? We don't graze all day long. Like, we don't sit there and just eat a bite, wait, eat a bite, wait, at least I don't. We normally sit down and we eat 3 large meals a day, right? And when you look at that plate of food that you eat, that's a good amount of food. Like, if you put that in a bag, that has to be a pretty decent sized bag. So the stomach has to have the ability to really hold this really big, large amount of food at one time. And as we'll see in a little bit, it only pushes a little bit into the small intestines at a time. So it really has to accommodate this whole huge meal and then hang out with it for a while. So it's gotta be big. It has to expand, it has to swell, and it has to be able to store that food for a while. It also, we said, mechanically breaks down food. And this might seem kind of weird. Like, you think of mechanical digestion like your teeth, right? This actual crushing and tearing and pulling apart. But your stomach does mechanically break down the food. And we said that it does this by doing this weird like swooshing or like mixing movement. When we look at the stomach, we'll see that there are actually 3 layers of muscle. Remember the rest of the GI tract? The tube actually has 2 layers of muscle, right? Longitudinal and circular. When we look at the stomach, there's this like oblique layer of muscle as well. So there's an odd angle 3rd layer of muscle present. And that allows the stomach to do these weird like rippling movements. So the food that's sitting in there gets like swished around, and it gets like hit up and down and just moved around a lot, and that churns it, right? So the stomach's always kind of churning up and mixing up your food, and that helps to break it down. But if you just put something in water, that's a lot different than putting it in water and then messing with it a bit, right? And mixing it and churning it up. That helps to break it down more. This converts the food that we ate into this liquidy substance called chyme. Okay, kind of like milkshakey, like a thin milkshake, but really acidic, really liquidy. Everything gets dissolved and broken down to this kind of uniform chyme. We also have the chemical breakdown of food occurring in the stomach. And this happens a few different ways. One, the actual acid, the hydrochloric acid can break chemical bonds. So we see this especially with like some plants. There are some bonds that are in plant materials that the acid will literally just start to break those bonds. Some like cartilage and collagen, collagen, not cartilage, some collagen that we see from animals. Some things can be chemically broken down by the acid itself. We'll see in a second though that the acid's also important for activating other enzymes. When we look at the stomach, we see that we'll have the chemical digestion of proteins. We have an enzyme present in the stomach called pepsin. And pepsin is an enzyme that will actually start to chemically digest proteins, so start to break them down into smaller polypeptides. Remember, we do have some chemical breakdown of lipids, right? But that's from the lingual lipase. So just be careful that you understand how that's happening. The lipids are being broken down, but they're being broken down because of the secretions from the stomach. Okay, so understand that distinction. Finally, in the stomach, we have the production of something called intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is necessary for us to absorb vitamin B12. We'll see that vitamin B12, the cells that line the small intestine are not able to actually absorb the vitamin without intrinsic factor being present. And so intrinsic factor is absolutely necessary for B12. So we'll take a second to look at the histology, right, or the cells that are present lining the stomach. Once we enter the stomach, the epithelium changes. Right, what kind of epithelium did we have in the mouth, in the pharynx, and the esophagus? What was it? Stratified squamous, right? A stratified squamous epithelium. Once we get to the stomach, now we have a simple columnar epithelium. Okay, so one layer of these really tall column-shaped cells. Also, we see that the epithelium is organized into these gastric pits. So you'll see like the lining of the stomach will go like this, and then it kind of like drops down into this weird shaped thing like that. So this is the lining of the stomach, right? And then the cells drop down, and it's a gastric pit. Gastric refers to the stomach, and it's like a pit, right? With a pit, like a big hole in the ground. So you drop down from the normal lumen of the stomach into this gastric pit. When we look at these gastric pits, they're important because this is where the cells are that make all of the gastric secretions. So like that's essentially the gland of the stomach. That's where all of the enzymes and intrinsic factor and mucus and all of that's going to be made. When we look at each of these gastric pits, so this is just showing you how it's communicating with multiple little glands. Again, where all of these cells are, these cells make all the different secretions. So that's what we call our gastric glands. Up here, this is called the neck of the gland. And again, kind of like the thin connector part is typically what we call a neck. In the neck of the glands, we have a lot of mucus cells present. Okay, so sometimes we call them mucus neck cells because they're located in the neck of that pit. But these mucus cells are extremely important. So remember we said that the stomach is equipped to deal with the acid, right? Nothing else is. The esophagus is not, the throat is not, the small intestine is not. And the reason for that is this incredibly thick layer of mucus that's present. And later we'll see too that the mucus actually has stuff to deactivate the acid. So the esophagus has a little mucus, but it's nothing like what we see in the stomach. So the stomach, these mucus neck cells will produce tons and tons of this, this mucus that can actually deactivate the acid. And the whole lining of the stomach will be covered with this. So there's a huge amount of protection up here for the lining of the stomach so that the acid that's here in the lumen is not actually getting to these cells that are lining the stomach. Okay, so they're completely protected. Notice that when we look at when we looked at the functions of the stomach on the last slide, we did not say absorption, right? There was no absorption there. And this is one of the reasons why. There's no way anything can get through this. There's so much mucus because we don't want the acid to get through that nutrients just can't make it through this thick layer of mucus to get to the cells to actually be absorbed. Okay, so no absorption is going to be occurring in the stomach. Alright, so this is the stomach up here. Okay, that's like the lumen where all of the food is going to be. Right, and we've got the lining of our stomach here, right, organized into our nice little rugae, our nice folds. And you can see one layer of columnar cells, right? With columnar cells, remember the nuclei are gathered towards the bottom of the cell. This is showing you how it thins out, like the neck region, and then we widen into the actual glands, the actual glandular region where we make a bunch of secretions. We said that in this neck region is where we have a bunch of mucus cells. Okay, so these are all mucus cells that are going to make a really, really thick layer of mucus that comes up here and protects all of the surface cells. And then down here in the glands where we make all of our gastric secretions, notice we have numerous different types of cells present. Okay, the smooth muscle cells are just there to kind of squeeze the glands and push the secretions up so they make their way up into the stomach. But we have parietal cells present. We have G cells that are going to make hormones that help to stimulate the digestive process. And then we also have chief cells present. Okay, we'll see these parietal cells are important for intrinsic factor and the hydrogenyl chloride for hydrochloric acid. And that chief cells are important for something called pepsinogen, which is a pro-enzyme or an inactive enzyme. Don't let me lose you. I know this isn't the most exciting chapter ever, but I can see the glaze in your current. Do like a little dance for you. We're almost done. Okay, so when we look at these gastric glands, note that most of these gastric glands, like these deep pits and deep gastric glands that have all of those parietal cells and G cells and chief cells, are present mostly in the body of the stomach. So when you look at the stomach, remember you come in, there's the esophagus, this first little part you enter, just like that tiny part, is the cardia. It's just an entrance. Like nothing's actually happening there, it's just where the food comes in. Then you have like this extra bulb, this storage chamber up here, which is the fundus. The main part of the stomach, remember, is the body, and then you have this little like J thing, which is the pylorus. Most of these gastric glands are going to be present here in the body. That's where most of the digestion is occurring. The cardia, again, it's just a doorway. It's just an entryway. The fundus is just for extra storage. So if I fill tons of stuff up in here, it might need to go hang out up there for a little while until I have room. By the time we get to the pylorus, we're trying to get this stuff ready and put it in the small intestine. So the last thing I want to do is secrete a bunch of acid right here and then put it in the small intestine and get rid of the acid. That's just wasteful, right? So we secrete most of the acid and enzymes and everything here in the body where we can use them for a while. And then by the time we get over here, we're really just coating it with mucus to protect it, okay? So gastric glands, again, we're gonna secrete another 1.5 liters. Okay, so 1.5 liters or 1,500 milliliters of gastric juice. Okay, so we had 1.5 liters in the mouth, another 1.5 liters going into the stomach. And when we look at this gastric juice, again, it's mostly water, but we have numerous other chemicals and enzymes and secretions that get put into that water. When we look at the glands, we saw that we have multiple different types of cells, and that the different cells have different secretions that all have different functions. The mucus cells are simple, right? We already talked about them. The mucus cells secrete what? What do the mucus cells secrete? Mucus. And what is the function of mucus? Protection. Protective, right? Or protection. The mucus is really protective because of all of like the nasty secretions that we have in the stomach. Parietal cells, we said, secrete intrinsic factor. The intrinsic factor goes into the stomach and it just stays here, right? And everything gets pushed from the stomach into what organ? The small intestine. The small intestine is where we have most of our absorption occur. The small intestine is where we want to absorb a vitamin called vitamin B12. What do we have to have in order to absorb vitamin B12? Intrinsic factor. Okay, so the intrinsic factor just gets released in the stomach. It makes its way around so that we can absorb B12 in the small intestine. Okay, B12 is important for a lot of stuff. Remember, like red blood cell production? The parietal cells also secrete this hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid, a couple things. One, it's not secreted as hydrochloric acid. Okay, the parietal cell does not release hydrochloric acid. The parietal cell actually releases hydrogen ions and chloride ions. And we'll see how it actually does that later, but it secretes the ions separately. This hydrochloric acid, remember, breaks bonds, right? It dissolves things itself. And we'll see in a second, the hydrochloric acid is also important for activating, so it activates enzymes. So that's the parietal cells. Also down in those glands, we have chief cells. Chief cells secrete something called pepsinogen. Okay, pepsinogen is an inactive proenzyme. And so like remember, proenzyme is like a pre-enzyme. So it later gets activated into an active enzyme. We'll see that pepsinogen, which is inactive, gets activated into pepsin. So pepsin is the active enzyme, and pepsin digests proteins. What do you think activates pepsinogen into pepsin? Beautiful, hydrochloric acid. And remember we said hydrochloric acid is important because it activates enzymes. That hydrochloric acid is necessary for activating pepsinogen into pepsin, and then it can go ahead and start breaking down proteins. There's some discussion and controversy about the gastric lipase coming from chief cells. There could be a little bit, a tiny bit of breaking down of lipids with this gastric lipase, but remember we have lingual lipase that's left over from the saliva that's going to work better in the stomach. So that's present there to break down lipids as well. G cells are enteroendocrine cells. So they're present, they release endocrine type hormones that stimulate the whole gastric process. We'll talk about the hormones more at the very end when we talk about the liver and gallbladder and pancreas. But G cells secrete something called gastrin. And the gastrin is going to stimulate the secretion from parietal cells and chief cells. Okay, so stimulates gastric secretion from parietal and chief cells. And then it stimulates intestinal motility. So it stimulates contraction of the muscles and then relaxation of the sphincters that are present. So everything kind of gets moved forward, right? You tell the muscles to contract and to kind of do peristalsis, right? To push everything forward, and then you relax the valves so that it can go from the small intestine into the large intestine. And that makes room in the small intestine for everything that's coming from the stomach. Again, we'll talk about hormones all the last section. I really want to get through this. This looks super busy, you guys. Like, this is not something that you'll be questioned super heavily on. I want to show you the way it works. So it's really cool. So here, this is showing you one of the cells that's present in the gland. Okay, so this is the parietal cell. What did we say parietal cells make? Intrinsic factor and what else? Hydrochloric acid. Okay, and this is showing you the lumen. Okay, so that's going into the gland and then into the stomach. So when we look at this parietal cell, remember I told you that the hydrogen ions and chloride ions are excreted separately, right? It's not released as hydrochloric acid, it's released as separate ions. So when we see that, do you remember this reaction from respiratory? Remember we had this buffer system that occurs in the blood? And that's why we said that CO2 is so important for pH. Because remember, carbon dioxide and water are going to give us carbonic acid, right? H2CO3. Carbonic acid, remember, dissociates into bicarb, which is a negative, an anion, and then hydrogen ions, cation. The hydrogen ions are going to get actively pumped into the stomach, okay, so that's where the hydrogen ions are coming from. And then look over here, we have this, this anion, it's called a countertransporter. Remember, countertransporters trade things in opposite directions. Co go together, counter go apart. This is a countertransporter that trades anions. It trades negatively charged ions. So it takes this negatively charged bicarb and pumps it out, while it takes another negatively charged chloride and pumps it in. And then the chloride just diffuses through a passive channel into the lumen. So that's where our hydrogen comes from and then where our chloride comes from. We call this the bicarb that comes out, remember, is like basic, right, or alkaline. We call this stream of bicarb from the stomach the alkaline tide. We'll talk about the importance of that when we do renal. So just kind of remember that's where the alkaline tide is coming from. All that bicarb is coming from. So finally, a couple last points. We've kind of talked about this a little bit, but there's a lot of chemical digestion that's starting in the stomach. This is where really most of the chemical digestion is beginning. We said that in the stomach there's a really acidic environment because those parietal cells are releasing the hydrochloric acid, right? So there's tons of acid going to the stomach. It's extremely acidic. This is important, we said, because it's protective. It helps to kill some of the microbes and pathogens that we ingest. And we said that it also helps to break down some collagen and connective tissue. So the acid does break some bonds itself. This is also important because remember we said that the acid activates pepsinogen into pepsin, right? Pepsinogen is not active. That's what comes from the chief cells, proenzyme. The hydrochloric acid activates it into pepsin, which is an active enzyme, which can then break down proteins. Here you see that the stomach performs preliminary digestion of proteins. So we've got these huge proteins with tons of amino acids, and we break it down to smaller polypeptides. Okay, and then later in the small intestine, we'll break it down further into amino acids. Remember we said lingual lipase is still active, and we have some gastric lipase coming in, and that's going to break down lipids. Remember, salivary amylase is not working anymore because it does not work in an acidic environment. It only works up in the mouth. And we already mentioned this, but while we really have chemical digestion starting really actively now in the stomach, we have no absorption occurring here, okay, because of that thick mucus layer. Thank you for bearing with me. I know I went over